Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into something massive today. We are pulling back the curtain on the hidden architecture that actually drives global events, and we're doing it by putting two completely different frameworks side by side. On one hand, we've got financial analyst Simon Dixon looking at the balance sheets. On the other, we've got spiritual author Kukulkan tracking human history and memory. One follows the money, the other follows the mind, and yet, incredibly, they both arrive at the exact same diagnosis of how our modern world operates.
So, let's tackle this head-on. Who actually runs the world? I mean, if you just watch the nightly news, you think the politicians standing at the podiums are the ones calling the shots, right? Well, if we look past those visible figures, we find what both Dixon and Kukulkan argue is the real, hidden machinery of global control. To figure this out, we're going to hit four main beats today: the architecture of power, the debt-based Ponzi scheme, war as a business, and finally, how you can actually opt out of the system. All right, jumping right into part one, the architecture of power.
We really need to begin by diagnosing the core problem. And what's absolutely fascinating here is how perfectly Dixon's economic, financial, industrial complex maps directly onto Kukulkan's spiritual Archontic Control Complex. Dixon points to asset managers like BlackRock, massive defense contractors, and tech giants operating in this ruthless game of profit. Kukulkan expands on that to include legacy institutions, the crown, the church, health systems, and the media. And the key takeaway? They don't need to sit together in some cartoonish, smoky back room. They are automatically aligned by shared incentives. They manage global wealth, and above all, they want to preserve their own continuity. And that really brings us to the core thesis of both texts. It's like watching a puppet show. On the surface level of politics, we see what look like independent institutions, democratic elections, and sovereign national borders. But pulling the strings behind the curtain is a hidden architecture. This operates through lobbying, supranational institutions, and massive debt dependency. What looks like independent, localized politics is usually just finance, and what appears to be finance is, more often than not, a mechanism for global influence.
Which leads to this incredibly profound observation from Kukulkan: power rarely disappears, it changes costume. The massive empires of the old world didn't just vanish into thin air, right? They just rebranded. They traded in their military conquests for modern, supranational complexes that control data, money, and our daily narratives.
Moving on to Section 2, the debt-based Ponzi scheme.
So how do these complexes actually maintain their grip? Well, Dixon gives us a fascinating historical lens for this. He basically argues that the modern financial system is essentially the world's longest-running Ponzi scheme. It really kicked into gear in 1694 when the Bank of England started issuing perpetual loans to fund wars because, what's a war without a little perpetual interest? Then, wealth consolidated globally under the Federal Reserve System during the World Wars. By 1971, the U.S. takes the dollar off the gold standard entirely. And today, the entire global economy relies on rolling over this artificial debt to funnel hard assets to the top, while the rest of us are left holding the bag. Just to put that into perspective, look at this staggering number: $38 trillion. That is the current U.S. national debt. Dixon explains that keeping this afloat literally requires non-stop money printing and inflation. In this architecture, national governments are basically just a piggy bank. You and I aren't just workers. In the eyes of this system, we are effectively products designed to owe money. We are assets for banks to extract value from.
Now, Kukulkan mirrors Dixon's economic warning, but he adds a really fascinating spiritual layer to it. He introduces this concept called depth time. Instead of experiencing natural, sacred time, he argues humanity is trapped in an artificial, extractive operating system. Debt time is that constant whisper in your ear, telling you you're always behind, that you owe something, and that you have to surrender your future and your labor to serve this massive war, money, data complex.
And just to clear up a lot of the common conspiracy theories you might see online, Dixon points out that this system isn't run by some hidden, singular religious cabal. If you look at the global wealth distribution alignments, it spans across everything: Christian, atheist, Muslim, and Jewish demographics. The architecture isn't driven by one group pulling strings based on ideology. It's driven by ruthless profit maximization and access to cheap capital across completely distributed global asset managers.
Which brings us to Section 3, war as a business. Because if debt is the engine of this whole system, global conflict is absolutely the fuel. Dixon outlines how modern war functions as a highly predictable corporate business cycle. Step 1, destabilize a region using intelligence or economic pressure. Step 2, install compliant leadership. Step 3,
funnel tied loans into that country so they can buy weapons specifically from military defense contractors. And finally, step 4, assets strip the nation via global asset managers to repay that exact debt. According to this framework, geopolitical conflicts are rarely about defending democracy. They are about generating guaranteed corporate revenue. We can actually see this dual analysis applied directly to the Ukraine conflict. Dixon approaches it purely through the lens of geopolitics and economics. He views it as a mechanism for asset acquisition, NATO expansion, and giant windfalls from military contractors. Kukulkan, on the flip side, views it as a civilizational proxy war involving legacy religious influence, contrasting the Vatican with Russian Orthodoxy. But here is a crucial part. Regardless of which lens you use, both sources adamantly agree on one tragic bottom line. Innocent families are ultimately the ones being sacrificed to keep this machinery running.
So what is the chilling end result of all this? We are actively being pushed into a K-shaped economy. The connected few at the top leg of the K gather up all the hard assets and wealth, while the massive demographic at the bottom leg is left with depreciating fiat currency, crippling consumer debt, and what Kukulkan vividly describes as spiritual amnesia. All right, section 4, let's talk about opting out of the system.
I know, that was a lot of heavy stuff. But we don't have to just sit here and go down with the ship. Both sources present us with parallel lifeboats. On the financial side, Dixon says you have to actively boycott the fiat system. That means holding wealth in self-custody Bitcoin, getting out of massive corporate index funds, and intentionally putting your money toward local farmers. On the spiritual side, Kukulkan advocates for a massive course correction from within, shifting global consciousness, adopting natural time, utilizing regenerative currencies like Anucoin, and supporting democratic counterforces to push back against technocratic overreach.
Let's actually zoom in on Kukulkan's concept of TunUc for a second. He believes that true liberation isn't just about shuffling your finances around. It requires a completely new, or actually very old, operating system for human life. The TunUc calendar is essentially designed to yank our energy away from extraction and constant rushing and plug us back into sacred human value. It's about reconnecting to community and remembering who we are outside of the corporate machinery.
So, bringing it down to earth, what does this actually mean for your daily routine? The biggest takeaway here is that while you probably can't take down a multi-trillion-dollar global complex head-on, you can absolutely intentionally boycott its mechanisms. You can avoid consumer debt to starve the Ponzi scheme, you can hold your assets outside of legacy banks, you can actually go shake the hand of your local butcher or farmer, and you can consciously resist the artificial outrage algorithms on your phone.
This synthesis really captures the essence of both of these sources perfectly. The old world prints debt. The new world remembers value. True wealth and true sovereignty aren't just about escaping inflation or picking the right stock portfolio. It is fundamentally about realigning our lives with genuine purpose, real community, and memory. The old system extracts. The new world remembers what is actually valuable.
I'm going to leave you with that provocative thought to ponder. Because as the architecture of power inevitably shifts towards some shiny, new, digital, and technocratic costume, the real question is, will you be paying enough attention to recognize the costume change before you surrender your sovereignty all over again? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this explainer today, and as always, remember to keep questioning the world around you.